How you doing? This is Jonathan Mejia, and this is my Unit 6 speech for in regards to memory, learning, and communication. So let's just go ahead and get into it. So when we talk about memory, we have to break it down into three categories, which are sensory, short-term, and long-term. Our brains basically capture everything, but it doesn't retain all that information. And basically, these three categories are how our brain basically splits that information. Memories are basically situations in our life and situations and stimuli that are introduced into our brain throughout our lives. Sensory memory is the first part of this. This type of memory is produced in fractions of a second to a few seconds. Because sensory memory occurs due to stimuli in a person's senses, it is further broken down into three types, which is echoic memory, iconic memory, and haptic memory. Iconic memory retains information that is gathered through sight. Echoic memory retains information gathered through auditory stimuli, and haptic memory retains data acquired through touch. A good example of sensory memory would be when, like, let's say a friend says something to you, but you're not really paying attention to them. And even though you weren't paying attention to them, when they finally do get your attention, you still know what they were exactly what they were asking you. You're still able to answer them, even though you weren't actually conscious. It still went in through your auditory sense. Like I said, so this type of memory, sensory memory, basically is goes through the sensory cortexes of the brain and relates through the thalamus. This information comes from the environment through your senses, and then goes through the sensory register process, and then it's stored in the temporal and the occipital lobes. Once we move on from basically the sensory memory, on our second stage, we have our short-term memory or awareness memory. This type of memory is still quick, anywhere from seconds to like minutes. It can be held longer by like repeating the actual information. A good example is when you go like to a grocery store and you're like, oh, I really need to remember myself to that I need milk. So you just continue to like buy milk, buy milk, buy milk, buy milk. That could, extend that short-term memory. Um, from there you have basically, so this working memory is a temporary based store of a subset of the sensory information that to which attention has been applied to. It is generally considered to have its substrate in the frontal lobes and the cortical areas concerned with basically sensory processing. Once we finish the short-term memory, we then move on to basically our last stage. We have long-term memory, which is a consolidation of short-term memory. Not all the short-term memory is transferred over to long-term memory. This type of memory is basically solid and can stay with you for days, weeks, years, or even a decade. A good way to basically think of something that's a long-term memory would be if you could think back at a very important event. Something like, for me, would be, my high school graduation. Even though it was around like a decade ago, I can still recall moments of what happened during that day, and basically being able to recollect and retrieve that is what would be considered long-term memory. The more you retrieve this information, actually, it becomes more solid in your actual long-term memory. Long-term memory can be split into two categories, which is declarative and the non-declarative. Declarative memory basically stores facts and events that are available to our conscious recall. It relies on the medial temporal lobe, including the hippocampus and its connections to adjacent structures such as the parahippocampal gyrus, the ethereal cortex, and the limbic system to facilitate basically the encoding and the consolidation of new information. Non-declarative is mostly used for a person's behaviors, skills, and knowledge that have been learned from that person's environment. It is memory that has been conditioned into them unconsciously. Emotions Emotions play a big part in long-term memory. The amygdala is essential to both the encoding and the retrieval of emotional memories. However, both the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex also play important roles, which are part of the subcortical structure responsible for long-term memory. From there, will go ahead and move on to basically learning and memory and how the environment basically affects it. As we talked about stimulus response, motor and perceptual and relational learning we have come to understand that stimuli are what helps all these learning processes occur, from the sensory stimuli that the environment basically provides for motor learning, to modify our neural circuits. The environment and events of a person also create stronger memories, which help with perceptual learning. A good way to describe that would be a person that basically went through some type of trauma, like a mugging, like in a dark alley, and then that person basically starts actually recognizing dark alleys right away, just because of the fact of prior that prior moment and event. That basically then becomes part of that person's perceptual learning, and basically becomes a memory in their, and ends up becoming probably a long-term memory, especially if it ends up being a trauma. From there, I want to go ahead and we'll talk about how communication, when we look at communication from like a neurological standpoint, our brain is basically like a motor. The reason I say it is because many aspects of the brain are used just for someone to carry a conversation. Just basically me talking right now is, or my brain is just going into overload. Well, not overload, but it's a lot of mechanisms are moving in there. Basically, some of the responsibilities of those brain parts are, so if we look at the left hemisphere, the left hemisphere is basically is responsible for language comprehension and speech. We look at the right hemisphere, it basically processes like the emotional content. It also controls the rhythm, the stress of the language, and the comprehension of figurative aspects of language. We then have the occipital, temporal, and the parietal lobes. These perceive all events and memories, so they can use it in a conversation. So it basically, they basically bring back memories, so you could actually use them while you're talking in a conversation. The Broca's areas is basically used for the language production. The right parietal and the temporal cortex is used for basically voice recognition, and those are just basically just some of the parts of that the brain uses for communication. There's a lot more. I think I'd be here all day if I basically went into every single one of them. But again, there's that's basically my speech. Thank you for listening. It was a honor to get this done, and have a great day.